Let me be very clear. The Government of Canada will return all of the money collected through pricing pollution back to Canadians.
Polluting in this country comes with a price now, according to the federal government. Today, it announced the details of the carbon tax it will impose on provinces that don't have a climate plan that meets Ottawa's standards. The tax will push the price of gas, oil, and propane higher, but the feds insist consumers will not bear the brunt of those costs, so they're offering families in the affected jurisdictions cash back. What does that mean for you? The CBC's Catherine Cullen is on this story for us and joins us now. Hey, Catherine, thanks for being with us.
Hey, Vashi.
Let's start with that part, and then we'll get to the rebate. How will the tax work or the price work?
Yeah, and it is important for everyone to know that we are talking about the provinces where this is actually going to be imposed by the federal government. So we're talking about Ontario, New Brunswick, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. And in those cases, this is going to kick in a couple of phases. As of January 1st, big emitters are going to be taxed. Now, according to senior officials, they're actually still ironing out the specifics of how all of that is going to work. So, in fact, we won't see the plan or all the details of the plan for taxing big emitters until later on in the year, but it will be retroactive all the way to January 1st. The other part of this plan is a fuel tax. It's going to kick in on April 1st. Obviously, what a lot of people are going to be thinking about primarily is gasoline, but it will apply to a variety of fuels. Now, conveniently, right around the time that fuel tax kicks in, the other component of all of this, the rebates to households, those will come via you filling out your CRA taxes right around the same time.
Yeah, and I want to ask you a bit more about that. How will that rebate system work?
And in fact, there is a lot of detail here. So people will fill out their tax forms. If they're in one of the affected provinces, they'll get a rebate. How much depends on which province you live in. It also depends on how many people are in your household. And then there are additional rebates as well. So for instance, if you live in a small or rural community, an additional 10% rebate. That has some people asking, notably Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, well, if people are just getting the money back, what is the point of all this? Here's what the Prime Minister had to say.
It is common sense that if you put a price on something you don't want, pollution, people will pollute less. And if there are costs associated with for average families, we will more than compensate those families for those costs.
Now, senior government officials in a technical briefing this morning did explain that they estimate it's about 70% of households that are actually going to get back more money than they will spend on carbon tax, not only at the fuel pumps, but also the other ways that the cost of all this might be passed on to consumers. There's also a whole host of other rebates. Actually, too much for us to get into here, but the government is looking at ways to compensate fishers, farmers, cities, universities, Indigenous communities. So this is a really big and frankly quite complex system that we're talking about.
Okay, thanks a lot, Catherine. The CBC's Catherine Cullen. The plan is facing fierce opposition from some provinces and could become a lightning rod issue in the federal election campaign. Are the Liberals confident Canadians will accept a carbon tax? And what happens if the provinces who've launched legal fights win? Joining me now is the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, Dominic LeBlanc. Hi, Minister. Nice to see you again.
Hey, Vashi. Thanks for having me on the program.
Thank you for coming in. If Canadians know that they're going to get a rebate, what is the incentive to change their behavior?
Well, the incentive, obviously, is if you're able to consume less fuel, to use less fuel that is part of the global emissions challenge, then the rebate will mean you'll, in fact, be financially ahead. As the Prime Minister said, I think very clearly, if you put a price on something you want less of, typical behavior, economic analysis, a very basic analysis would say that people will do less of it. We don't think that pollution should be free, but we also recognize for middle-class families, this cost should be reimbursed in the jurisdictions where the federal plan would apply. And it's important also to note that the large emitters, the industrial emitters, for example, will be also paying a price on their pollution. And that's not reimbursed to them. That's not refunded to them. That will be going into the pockets of Canadian families.
What about the people, though? For example, I lived in southwestern Saskatchewan for a year. It is very hard not to use a car there. How do you expect, I mean, this is going to cost them more.
But no, and look, I represent a riding in rural New Brunswick that when I was elected had less than 6 traffic lights. Closest metro system to the community I represent is in Boston. So I totally understand, and our government understands, that people who live in rural communities use cars and trucks to commute to work or to take their kids to the arena for hockey practice or ringuette. We totally understand it, and that's exactly why, for those families, we will be reimbursing them more than they will pay in any modest increase cost of fuel. So there's a perfect example where they will come out ahead. But if they decide to carpool to the hockey practice, if they decide, not to drive to a particular activity, or to go with a family member or a neighbor, or at one point they're going to change their car, they decide to buy a more fuel-efficient car, all of those decisions will in fact put them financially ahead.
What about the cost downloaded to them as consumers? This is the rebate is 90%. The other 10% is being given to places that to mitigate basically the places that can't download their costs to consumers. Is that not an admission that those costs will be downloaded to consumers for businesses, for example?
Well, it's not businesses. It would be like hospitals, universities,
But the reason
schools.
they're getting money is because they can't download the extra cost to consumers, meaning that other businesses will be.
We think that other businesses will have an economic incentive, and all the economic analysis, including recent Nobel Prize-winning economic research, Vashi, made it very clear that if there is an economic incentive to pollute less, businesses will do exactly that. I mean, think of the emissions profile of certain industries 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and now. It's improved over time. We think that there's considerably more work to do, and we're giving an economic incentive to businesses to do this. This has existed in British Columbia for well over a decade. It is amongst the most performing economies in the Canadian Federation, in Quebec as well, in the European Union. I mean, this isn't a new instrument. The Conservatives simply have no plan. Andrew Scheer is not interested in talking about what a Conservative government would do. He's interested in making stuff up and exaggerating a Liberal plan that, Vashi, we were very clear in 2015 in the election would be part of what our government would do to take serious action against climate change.
You said you would take action. You didn't say at the time you would impose on provinces whatever your plan is.
Well, no, because we had worked collaboratively with the provinces 2 years ago and came up with something, bureaucrats like these phrases, a pan-Canadian framework. I'm sure your viewers love that phrase too. But what it meant, though, Vashi, is that the provinces and territories had agreed with the Government of Canada on common action. Now, if a provincial election
but common action isn't what's dictated. It maybe wasn't in their minds as dictated by the federal government. I mean, I understand.
No, well, we were always
campaigned
clear
on action on climate change. You did not campaign on saying that this is how much the carbon tax will be or carbon price will be,
Vashi,
and I'm imposing it on
we
you.
were very clear 2 years ago that if provinces didn't have a plan that met these common objectives, that the federal plan would then apply. So in some provinces, Conservative governments think that somehow their forming a government constitutes a climate plan. Some of the actions that the Ford government in Ontario have taken have been extraordinarily regressive in terms of reducing emissions.
They say their plan's coming out in a month.
Well, I was in the legislature last week, and they were having an uncomfortable question period explaining that they had no plan, but it didn't surprise me because I sit in question period in the House of Commons and see that Andrew Scheer doesn't have a plan either.
What about a plan like the one from Manitoba? They had a plan. They said it worked best for their province. You didn't like it.
No, they had a plan. They had submitted a plan which we thought met these common objectives that everybody had agreed to, all the provinces and territories 2 years ago. And then they sort of withdrew the plan, or sort of sent a notice indicating, you know what, we don't want to submit that plan.
So was their plan when it entailed their own carbon tax at a price that was different, at a constant price of $25, I believe, was that satisfactory to your government?
It would have been for a number of years, absolutely.
But you still would have raised it eventually.
Well, we were open to having a conversation with them in 2 years as to what...
Because we've had the Premier on, and he seemed to indicate that you guys were giving him your government was giving a hard no.
We gave him a hard no when he withdrew the, we thought, positive plan that they had previously submitted. So if Premier Pallister decides to flip-flop on this, he shouldn't be surprised that he gets to a hard no when he withdrew the plan that we'd given a hard yes to.
He said, though, that he only withdrew it because your government had already said no to the plan he presented. Is that not true?
I think that that's perhaps the sequencing is a bit wrong in that analysis.
Okay, let me ask you from the other point of view, how, there are certain Conservative governments saying that this is a tax grab. There are other people who are saying it doesn't go far enough, that the price on carbon, the UN itself has said in order to be, fully effective in realizing the goals that the Prime Minister spoke about today and making a difference when it comes to climate change, it's going to have to be a lot more than $50 a ton. Is your government going to increase that price in the future?
We don't have we have a plan that takes us to a certain point where we think that at $50 a ton, that is a very significant step to...
Will that get you to the Paris climate targets?
We believe it will.
Because the submission last December to the UN was that the government would be 66 megatons short of where it's supposed to be.
Well, it's going to be more difficult if a government like Ontario, for example, decides to get rid of their cap-and-trade system, which would be the equivalent of opening a whole series of coal-fired electricity plants.
But that was prior to the Ontario government's election. That was in December of last year.
But our plan, for example, the price on pollution would be the equivalent of closing, just the price on pollution alone, is the equivalent of closing 30 coal-fired electricity plants. So there's a whole series of measures that actually go beyond just the price on pollution. To be fair, we're investing massively in public transit. We're investing in clean, green energy. There are programs with provinces, including my own, to look, for example, at helping low-income people with energy efficiency in their homes. There's a whole series of measures that we think Canadians expect their government to take.
But will that series of measures taken in totality be enough to achieve the Paris targets? Because as of last year, the submission from this government to the UN was that it would not be enough.
What we're saying, Vashi, is that if we work constructively with industry, with provincial partners, and everybody's focusing on the 4 provinces, some of whom, as I say, had a last-minute conversion, that still means 6 provinces and 3 territories are working constructively with us, including major parts of the Canadian economy. Major provinces like Quebec has been a leader for a long time in this issue.
But even Alberta,
British
for example,
Columbia.
to a certain point they're working with you, and until TMX gets built, after that they're not.
And we're prepared to have the conversation with the Alberta government when their particular plan would no longer be compliant with the agreed-upon framework. But for the moment, Alberta has been a climate leader, has put Premier Notley's government has been a very valuable partner, putting a hard cap on emissions. This is very significant improvement.
And yet she's not willing to see your plan the full way through at this point.
Vashi, Canadians expect their governments to take serious action. So if you have a bunch of politicians, in the case of the Conservatives in Ottawa, that have no plan, it seems to me if I was a resident in New Brunswick that saw these historic floods last spring, if I lived in Western Canada and saw some of the horrible wildfires that preoccupied the entire country this summer. Climate change is real. People expect their governments to take action. And we have said all along that putting a price on pollution is part of a coherent national plan. We wish the Conservatives, instead of making up facts about our plan, might have one of their own. And we think it's very difficult because they probably don't have one.
We continue to ask questions of them about that, but we're here. You're announcing a plan today, and we're here to ask questions of the government.
And that's why we're so happy to be here, Vashi, answering your questions. I can't think of anything I'd enjoy more.
I'm sure pretty much everything, but thank you very much.
You're too negative on yourself, Vashi.
Thank you, Minister. Appreciate your time today.
I'm happy to be here.
On Parliament Hill, as we just discussed, party leaders express frustration with the government's emission-cutting plan. The Conservatives argue a carbon tax will make everything more expensive, while the NDP and Greens say it doesn't go far enough. Have a listen.
This plan is wrong for taxpayers, it's wrong for the economy, and it's wrong for the environment. Conservatives, like Canadians, see through this cynical election gimmick, and we will hold Justin Trudeau to account for it.
It's a first step, but there's 2 big problems. One, the government has already put our public dollars towards purchasing a pipeline. And secondly, the targets that this current government, the Liberal governments, are using, those targets are not going to get us anywhere near where we need to go.
So it's a good start, but the message to Prime Minister Trudeau and Catherine McKenna right now has to be really tough. And this is from the Green Party, tough love. We love you brought the carbon price in. We think it's smart that Canadians will get those in the provinces where their province has rejected doing carbon pricing themselves. So in British Columbia, this will not apply. But for Ontario, Saskatchewan, and so on, this is a good decision. But it's approximately half of what needs to be done if we're to listen effectively to the warnings of science